how do we build a life that will last? So many times in life, I think we experience victory, but then something happens, and it completely wipes out whatever success we thought we had. You know, like sometimes in life, it's 2 steps forward and then 5 steps backwards. Like I lost 20 pounds over the summer, but then I gained 25 on Thanksgiving. You know, I worked on healing a relationship in my family, but then we had a big, huge blow up fight and it just feels like we're right back to the back. But how do we endure? How do we protect the good that is in our life when the troubles of life come knocking? How can I build a life that is resilient? Now, some of you might already know this, but I am a transplant to the Grand Rapids BYRON Center area. I'm actually from the east side of the state, suburbs of Detroit. My wife is from Grand Haven, so she's like a true blue West Michigander. You know, she fits right in. But I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit. I was born in Grosse Pointe. I lived in Troy and then Oxford for a while. And so as such, I am a lifelong supporter of Detroit sports. You know, the Lions, Tigers, Red Wings. I think they have a basketball team too. They're not doing very well right now. But I don't support them because they're good. I support them because they are my teams. It's okay if you support other teams. We can still be friends. I know God loves you. I'm working on it. You know. But I grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, right? And with the Detroit Lions, well, let's just say I didn't watch a lot of football growing up. But about 10 years ago, I became a pastor. And when I became a pastor, some of you know I can get a little excited on the stage, and we go really hard on Sunday mornings. And so I get home on a Sunday afternoon and I just crash. There's not a lot happening in the Mannschreck house on Sunday afternoon. My children think nap time is for them. No, nap time is for dad, right? Like I just want to do nothing. And so we started this tradition of watching the Lions games on Sunday afternoons. It was a great way to relax. They were terrible at the time, but they were my team. And so win or lose, I was going to watch them. And so I'll never forget when my boys got to be old enough to watch the games. One time we were watching the game and we were winning at the half. The Lions were up. And my son Liam looks up at me with his big, beautiful brown eyes. He's got his eyes from his mom. And he looks up at me. He was like 4 or 5 at the time. He's like, "Dad, are we going to win?" I don't want to crush his spirit, but also I don't want to set him up for failure. And I was like, "Oh no, bud, we're Lions fans." We're going to give it away in the second half. That's what always happens, right? Like this is how I taught my children in my house. I was like, we actually had a year where we lost every single game the whole season, 16 out of 16, 2008. It was awful. It's incredible. But then 2021 comes along and the Detroit Lions hire this fella named Dan Campbell to be the new head coach of the Lions. And after they hired him, he gave this speech. And to start out this morning, I wanted to read you a little snippet of this speech, and I cut out some of the more colorful language. And so this is right after they hired him. It's like his first press conference, right? And he gets up there and he says, "This team is going to take on the identity of this city, and this city has been down. But they found a way to get back up, all right? It has found a way to overcome adversity. And so this team is going to be built on, we're going to kick you in the teeth, all right? And when you punch us back, we're going to smile at you. And when you knock us down, we're going to get up. And on the way up, we're going to bite off a kneecap, all right? And we're going to stand up and it's going to take 2 more shots to knock us down. And on the way up, we're going to bite off the other kneecap. And then we're going to get up and it's going to take 3 shots to knock us down. And when we do, we're going to get up, we're going to take another hunk out of you. And before long, we're going to be the last one standing." And he gave that press conference. And I remember when it happened, I didn't actually watch it originally, but it made such a stir. Kind of scared people, I think. It was very intimidating, very aggressive. It was like, who is this new guy? But it went viral, and it's known, literally, you can Google it as Dan Campbell, the kneecap speech, right? Like, it's like, oh my gosh, who is this guy? They lost 13 games that year. 13 out of 16. Knocked down again and again and again. But then the next year, they lost 8. And then last year, they lost 5. And this year, yeah, Today, we're starting a new series called Resilient. We're going to talk about what it takes to build a life that will last, what it takes to overcome adversity, because I think for a lot of us, we have high expectations. We have big dreams. It's a new year. It's 2025. I'm finally going to lose the weight. I'm going to finish that home project. I'm going to fix that relationship. I'm going to get that promotion, accomplish that goal. But what do we do when life slaps us down? Over and over. This morning, I'm not going to get into how to build a life that has no problems, because that never happens. I'm much more interested in how do I build a life where I can handle anything the world's going to throw at me. And to do that, we're not going to get our advice from Dan Campbell, inspiring though he may be. No, we're going to take a look at a story of a very different Daniel. Now, Daniel might be one of the most famous books in the Bible. There's so many epic stories that a lot of us learned even when we were kiddos. Maybe even if you've not been to church since you were in Sunday school as a kid, you've probably heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Or you might remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego getting thrown into the fiery furnace, all that, right? Or maybe you've heard the phrase, the writing on the wall. Have you heard that phrase? That all comes from Daniel. That's chapter 5 in Daniel. And in this book, Daniel interprets dreams. He receives bizarre visions, stands up for his faith. He faces terrifying oppression and defeat. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to get into all those stories. And I'm really excited. It's going to be a lot of fun. But the important part is that through every trial, Daniel remains steadfast. He's one of the most incredible examples in scriptures of facing impossible obstacles without even so much as flinching. Daniel stood firm, resilient. This is a guy who knows how to build a life that will last no matter what the world throws at you. Now, before we get into it over the next couple of weeks, I want to take the time to give you a framework for the painting we are about to create. So we're going to dive into 2 Kings chapter 24. If you want to follow along in your Bible, you can grab one off the wall or bring it up on your phone. Because here's the thing about the Bible. We've actually talked about the prophets a lot lately. Like over Christmas, we talked about Jeremiah and all these different prophets. They are the mouthpiece of God. God would give them messages, and then they would give it to the people, to the king. But one of the most important things to understand about the Old Testament is that there's a chunk of books in the Bible that are history, right? That's all the stuff, the historical accounts of what's happening between the kingdoms in the world. And then there are these other books that are prophetic works. And those are what the prophet was saying while all this stuff is going on. And so we'll actually have different books of the Bible that are happening at the same time. One book tells you the history and what the army was doing, and one tells you about the stuff the prophet and the kings were talking about. Like if this was Game of Thrones or Rings of Power or one of that, this book is the battle scene, and this one's all the politics and drama and backstabbing and stuff that's happening at court. But it's all happening at the same time. So we dive into 2 Kings chapter 4. This is the battle scene, right? 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 10. And it says, during Jehoiachin's reign, the officers of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came up against Jerusalem and besieged it. And Nebuchadnezzar himself arrived at the city during the siege. And then King Jehoiachin, along with the queen mother, his advisors, his commanders, and his officials, surrendered to the Babylonians. Yeah. Babylonian army, King Nebuchadnezzar, which I maintain is the funniest name in the whole Bible. King Nebuchadnezzar. He comes in, he defeats Jerusalem. And then it keeps going in verse 13, 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 13. And he says, as the Lord had said beforehand, Nebuchadnezzar carried away all the treasures from the Lord's temple and the royal palace. He stripped away all the gold objects that King Solomon of Israel had placed in the temple. King Nebuchadnezzar took all of Jerusalem captive, including the commanders, the best of the soldiers, craftsmen, and artisans, 10,000 in all. Only the poorest people were left behind. Now, this might be the most important piece to understanding the book of Daniel, the practice of exile. You see, there was a common practice way back in the day. When a new empire would come in and take over an area, they would go in and take all the people and force them to move away. They say, okay, we're taking you all, you're moving away from home, send them somewhere new. They would come in, force everybody out, take them away from their homeland. And it's really effective because it takes the fighting spirit out of a group of people, right? Which makes them easier to control. If you're looking to control people, you got to kind of shake them up a little bit. And so every time in history, these empires would conquer massive. You ever seen the pictures? They're like the Babylonian Empire, and it's like huge areas of land. Once they conquer it, the question is, okay, how do we control it? And one of the best ways to control it was exile, to move people away from their homes. So they have nothing. They have no home. They have no land. They have no identity. They have no life. Exiles were basically just a shade above slaves. They often ended up as servants in the households. And listen again to who they took. Listen to this, verse 14. It says, they took all of Jerusalem, including the commanders, the best of the soldiers, craftsmen, and artisans, 10,000 in all. You can't take everybody. You can't physically fit them all there. So they just take the elite. They take the commanders, the craftsmen, the artisans. You move them to a new place and say, hey, assimilate. Get mixed in with the culture so that they lose their identity. Yeah? Verse 15, it finishes up. It says, so then Nebuchadnezzar led King Jehoiachin away as a captive to Babylon, along with the queen mother, his wives and officials, and all of Jerusalem's elite. He also exiled 7,000 of the best troops and 1,000 craftsmen and artisans, all of whom were strong and fit for war. Then the king of Babylon installed Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, as the next king, and he changed Mattaniah's name to Zedekiah. So you take all the leaders, all the elite, all the troops, and you ship them out to Babylon. Then you install a puppet king, right? A guy you choose, a guy who you control. And you teach them, you're done. Your identity is gone. You ship everyone out to Babylon, install a puppet king, and tell them, let go of your old life. That whole Israel thing, that's done. You're not Israel anymore. You are Babylonians now. So you get Babylonian names. They even change the people's names. The new ruler of the region, they're trying to strip them of anything they used to be attached to, even their name. It's all about conformity and control. Forget all that people of God stuff. That's not you anymore. You are Babylonians. And so that's the story of Daniel. He's been conquered, and he's this young kid. I mean, he's a young man, but he's basically a kid, and he's Jewish, and he's trying to figure out how to live as a Jewish person, as a person of God in this strange and foreign land in the face of incredible obstacles. Now, I know I'm kind of nerding out on some of this history stuff, and I hope you're still with me. I kind of maybe glazed eyes and whatnot. But let me take a second and show you how all of this applies to your life today. All the way over in the New Testament, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 10, we get this line. And this is how Daniel applies to your life today. Let's put it on the screen. This is 1 Peter. Once you had no identity as a people, but now you are God's people. Once you received no mercy, but now you have received God's mercy. Let's do the next slide. Dear friends, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls. And this is the key teaching I really want you to grab onto this morning. We, in our lives on this earth, we are exiles in a foreign land. As a follower of Jesus, if you're going to be a Christian, you're going to stick out, right? We have a whole set of values and a way that we live that looks weird to people outside our faith tradition. You see it all over our lives. It's the way we approach money, sexual ethics, generosity, forgiveness, conflicts, even just the way we approach having enemies. Nobody does it like Christians do. It's different than this world. The way we approach suffering and serving others and death, it's kind of like someone on the outside of Christianity looking in would say, wait, y'all mean you take a chunk of your money, you just give it to other people? You give it to the church or to the needy, to the hungry? Like with our economics, people will look at generosity and it baffles them. They're like, why would you do that when you could go shopping, right? Wait a minute, you're telling me you take time every day to think about other people and to talk to God about them and to pray for people? Why would you do that when you could be scrolling social media? Wait a minute, you mean there's a family that has no presents under the tree at Christmas, and it is 7 days before the biggest holiday, and everything's a chaotic nightmare in both our calendar and our wallet, but on no notice, 50% of the church is going to stand up and say, yes, I would like to sacrifice my time and money to help someone in need? Is that too obvious? These are not hypotheticals. When you build a life on the foundational principles of obeying God and serving your neighbor, it's going to create a life that is baffling to the rest of the world. I saw this thing on Twitter where there was this atheist who was trying to make fun of Christians. He was trying to make fun of us, and he said, look, if you believe in all that forgiveness stuff, you realize Paul, who killed Christians before he converted, Paul, he went to heaven. He had to face the people that he killed. And he was trying to like dunk on Christianity. He was trying to like make fun of us, but it completely backfired. He got majorly ratioed because there were so many Christians flooding his comments, talking about how actually that's really beautiful. There was this pastor, Jonathan Pokluda, who put it like this. He's like, yeah, the Apostle Paul entered heaven to the cheers of those he martyred, because that's how the gospel works. Like, to those of us who believe in forgiveness and the transformation that comes when you give your life to Jesus, it's not baffling, it's beautiful. But all of this gets to the main idea. A follower of Jesus is going to look like an exile on this side of heaven. Peter finishes up with verse 12. Check this out. Let's put it on the screen. He says, be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then, even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior and they will give honor to God when he judges the world. That verse right there, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, I think it's 12. It unlocks the book of Daniel for our lives in the modern world. I know there's a lot of cultural Christianity in West Michigan, but even still, we live in an unbelieving world, surrounded by unbelieving people, and Daniel is this great guide for how to live as exiles in Babylon. So let's jump back into Daniel. I have one more thing I want to show you. I think a lot of us, when we think about living as Christians and the world, attacking us or whatnot, a lot of us think of there's like this angry, aggressive, attacking force. But the reality is sometimes the world's ways are not aggressive. They're seductive. I think a lot of us imagine that temptation is going to be this moment where we are confronted by an easy and obvious moral choice. Like the world's going to come in and say, hey, murder this person. And we're going to say, no, I know murder is bad, so I'm not going to do it. Like in the real world, in our daily lives, it's much sneakier, alluring even. You'll hear things like, well, maybe it's okay to lie a little bit. Or maybe it's okay to keep a little bit more of that money for yourself. Does it really matter? What's the big deal if you just sleep with whoever you want to, right? Is it really that big a thing if I don't forgive people? Can't I just hold on to a grudge? The world is not going to draw a big, obvious moral red line and say, betray your values, cross that line. The assimilation of exiles is gradual. They're going to try and pull you in small ways here and there to get you to be like them. For Daniel, you've got to realize, it's sad to lose his home, but actually, Babylon was really cool. And he's this young kid. He shows up. He's living in the palace. The Babylonians were this powerful and advanced culture. They actually had impressive architecture. Did you know this? Babylon was the home to the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. There it is. The Hanging Gardens. That's an artist's depiction of it because they obviously were torn down a long time ago, but it was a mountain made out of levels of gardens, and it took really advanced engineering to get that thing to happen. The legend says Nebuchadnezzar had it built for his wife, the queen, because she missed the hills and greenery and the valleys of her homeland. They also had this thing called the Ishtar Gate, which looked like that. Just this really formidable and impressive structure, very impressive architecture. And what I'm trying to say with all of this is that it was a really impressive kingdom. It was awe-inspiring and very tempting to want to be a part of. But it was a world that was built on a foundation that was different than the people of God. There was this guy before Nebuchadnezzar was king. There was a different king of Babylon. His name was Hammurabi. You might have heard of him. He came up with one of the earliest and most comprehensive legal codes. Have you ever heard of Hammurabi's code? Right? I learned about that in history, in public school. Hammurabi's code was based on a system called an eye for an eye. We've heard of this, right? If you've ever heard that phrase, that's where it comes from. These people, the Babylonians. And of course, that is the system that Jesus is going to come in and destroy. Right? He comes in, completely destroys it a couple hundred years later. He says, look, you've heard about this eye for an eye thing. You've heard about that. But I'm going to tell you, Christians are going to do it a different way. So what I want you to realize is Babylon is not just a place of hardship and oppression. It's actually really cool and impressive, full of temptations for that exile. And what I want you to realize with all of this is that even when the world seems really cool, when it seems really good, God is better. Babylon was an amazing place, very impressive, and it made a lot of sense to a lot of people. That eye for an eye thing, it still makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. That's how we want to live our lives. But even when the world seems good, God is better. One of the crucial facts that exiles like Daniel had to hold on to is that even when the world seems good, God is better. Because a follower of Jesus is always going to look like an exile on this side of heaven. Peter tells us, he's like, you guys are strangers walking in a foreign land. That's what it should feel like in the world. Christians, with the way we follow Jesus, we will stick out in a world that is built on a different foundation. But here's where it gets really good. It turns out those raised in exile are stronger than those raised in comfort. Turns out, and this is so simple, it kind of feels obvious. It turns out when you face a life that is full of obstacles and things that you have to climb over, you actually learn to overcome and you become stronger than you would if you had a life where there were never any obstacles. Let me see if I can explain it like this. This is a kind of a cool story. A couple of decades ago, out in Arizona, there was a scientific experiment called Biosphere 2. Has anyone ever heard of this? It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. It's bizarre. They tried to create a huge, isolated dome to mimic Earth's ecosystem, right? There's a picture, sorry, it's so blurry, but it's a picture of Arizona, but they built this giant dome in the desert, and it was a 4-year experiment back in the 1990s, and it failed catastrophically. They ran out of food and oxygen, and everybody in it almost died. They had to cut it open and let everybody out so they wouldn't die. One of the biggest reasons it failed was they couldn't keep up an oxygen supply. They couldn't all the trees would grow really fast, and then without explanation, these trees were just toppling over. And they couldn't figure it out. They're like, why do our trees keep just falling over without explanation? So they started researching after the big failed experiment. They're researching it. And it turns out there's one thing that was missing from the tree's environment that we have on Earth. Wind. Trees need wind. As a tree grows, there's just a little bit of wind that pushes it back and forth, just a little. But what happens, it's enough that a tree develops something called stress wood. And stress wood actually has a different cellular structure than a normal tree would. Stress wood is why trees sway in the wind, but don't fall over. But if you grow up in a place where there's no wind and you never get pushed and pulled, you never have to deal with that resistance, you don't develop stress wood. So you just topple over. And that's what they saw in the experiment. And what that is, that reflects the biblical truth, which is this: without resistance, without challenges, and without obstacles, you will never develop strength. So just like Daniel living in Babylon, Christians who follow Jesus are always going to look like exiles this side of heaven. And that sounds like a bummer. And it is. To be an exile is a bummer. It can be really hard to follow Jesus when the culture is trying to push you in a different way. Sometimes we're oppressed and beaten up. Sometimes we're tempted and seduced. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's really hard to follow the way of Jesus in our world, but it will make you stronger. It will give you fruit of the Spirit. It will give you the character and spiritual muscles that God wants to grow in your life. The lesson of the exile is the lesson of stress wood. Through every struggle and every trial, you are growing the spine that you need to stand up to the rest of the world. So to close out, let's make this really practical. It's a new year. And I wanted to share with you my dream for Center Church this year. Because here's the thing, there are seasons where we need shelter, we need rest. And in those moments, I want the church to be a refuge for people who are beat up and broken. But when someone has recovered, what I really want this church to be is a spiritual training ground. I want Center Church to be a place that helps people develop spiritual stress wood. I talked about this a little bit on Christmas Eve. Wherever you are in your walk with Jesus, whether you're a brand new Christian or you've been a follower of Jesus for a decade, I want this church to be a place that nudges you a little bit closer to Jesus, that challenges you to be more Christ-like every day. And I'll tell you, this is hard for me as a leader too, right? Because I'm a huge people pleaser. I don't like challenging people. I just want to make you all happy. I just want to like tell you good things and make you comfortable all the days. That's what I'm good at. But then you'd never grow. And I would be a terrible pastor. Think about it like this. What if I was a personal trainer and I walked up and you're in the gym and you're trying to lift the weights and they're kind of heavy, and I walk up, I'm like, boy, those sure look heavy. Let's just get rid of that weight. Here's a coloring book. Let's go sit in the corner. Then you don't grow, right? Without weight, there is no growth. Without resistance, there is no resilience. What if this church, what if we could build a place that creates people who looks at all the problems life throws at them and says, I can handle it. I could do that. As a pastor, I dream of a church that is a training ground that prepares you for what life is going to throw at you, so that when it hits the fan, and I guarantee it will, some of you are in that right now. Sometimes I have to preach sermons that are like comforting, and they're like, you got this and God can do it. And sometimes when I preach those, I'm look out and I know the stories of what some of you guys are going through. And I'm like, this isn't the right message. Like, you don't need to hear the happy rah-rah stuff. You need to hear that, hey, this sucks and this is hard, but it's gonna help me grow because God's gonna walk with me in this. I think about our kids program, Center Kids, and I can't say enough about how much I love that program. The volunteers are so amazing, and it's so great. All my children are in there right now. But when I think about our program, I don't really care about how fun it is or how trendy it is, or how big it is. We have so many kids, I don't care about that. I want it to be known for spitting out kids who have an authentic belief in God that's going to last for their entire life. Because it doesn't matter if your church is giant and you've got hundreds of kids, if 5 years after graduation, they've all chewed up by the world and they've completely left the faith because they weren't prepared. We are no longer in the glory days of the American church where everyone's a Christian and everyone went to church and it's all just assumed. No, our exile has become more obvious. And what I hope you realize today is that actually that's probably a really good thing for us. So let me leave you with this last question. Where in your life is God asking you to live as an exile? What spiritual muscles do you need to develop? A resilient life, a life that is built to last. It is possible. So let's take that first step. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, the world can be so hard. We get beat up, broken down by all the things that come our way. Or sometimes we're not beat up, but we're tempted. We're seduced by the amazing glitter of Babylon, and we just want to give in. We don't want to live your way. We want to live the world's way. But God, I just ask that you would come into us and give us a spark. Give us that drive to climb over the obstacle, not to run away from the obstacles of life, but to learn how to handle them so that no matter what life throws at us, we know that if you're with us, we got this. Give us that strength, God. We love you so much. In your name, amen.